Hello, we are continuing the dramatic reading of The Return of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks. This is the second book in the Indian in the Cupboard series, and we are on Chapter 3, The Way It Began. Omri was rather a... excuse me. How about I start it right the first sentence here, guys, all right? Omri was rather a private person. At least he needed to be alone quite a bit of the time. So his room, which was right under the eaves of the house, was perfect for him. In the old house, his bedroom had been just one of several opening off of the upstairs landing. And at certain times of the day, it had been like a railway station. Railway station. His new room was off the beaten tracks. No one, in his opinion, had any reason to come up here or even pass the door. There were times, now that it had all been arranged to suit himself, when he forgot about how awful it was living in Hovel Road, when it seemed worth anything to Lee. He had forgotten how awful it was living on Hovel Road when it seemed worth anything to have a room like this. It's kind of a weird sentence, right? Forgive the stumble. It wasn't a very large room, so his father had built a shelf high up under the skylight for him to sleep on. This was great because he could look up at the night sky. Under this bed shelf were his desk and some shelves for his collections of old bottles, key rings, and wooden animals. The wall opposite the window was covered with his posters, a mixture of the old and new, from Snoopy and an early Beatles to the police, and a funny one about a flasher who gets caught in an elevator. In pride of place were two large photographs of Iroquois chiefs that he had found in magazines. Neither of these Indians looked remotely like Little Bear, but they appealed to Omri just the same. His clothes were stored on the landing, so his room wasn't cluttered up by them. That left quite a lot of space for his beanbag seats, a low table. He'd sawed its legs in half, their length, after seeing a photo of a Japanese room. So cool, kind of like a low-slung table off the ground. His cassette radio, and his most recent acquisition, an old chest. Remember, this book came out in the early 90s, so some dated sort of things there. Cassette player, pretty hip at the time. He found an old chest. He found this in the local market, coated with dirt and grease, and bought it for £2 after £2 after bargaining, and borrowed a cart from a market man to drag it around the corner to Hovel Road. He'd cleaned it with a scraper and some sandpaper out in the garden before hauling it up to his room. It had come up a treat, just as a man in the market had promised. The wood was oak and the hinges iron, and it had a brass plate on it with the name of its first owner. Omri had hardly been able to believe it when he had removed the layers of dirt from this plate and read the name for the first time. It was L. Bear. L. Bear. Little Bear. Of course it was pure coincidence, but as Omri thought, if I were superstitious. He shined the brass every week. Somehow it, too, made him feel a little closer to Little Bear. The chest was not only interesting and beautiful, but useful. Omri used it for storage. There was only one thing wrong with it. It had a lock, but no key. So he piled the cushions and other objects on it and pretended it was a bench. That way, nobody who happened to be prying about in his room — it still happened occasionally, mothers cleaning and brothers poking around and borrowing — would realize that it contained a number of interesting and private objects. Omri knelt by the chest now and shifted to the floor a pile of cassettes, a bull-worker. He was bent on developing his muscles. I guess it's some sort of like weight you lift or something like that. I'm sure like people who do this type of exercise are like, what are you talking about, Nick? I know what that is. Anyway, some cushions and 3 copies of Mad magazine. Now, there was a popular magazine back then, among other bits of junk. Then he opened the lid of the chest. It, too, was untidy, but Omri knew where to burrow. On their way down the left-hand side in search of the folder containing his prize-winning story, Omri's fingers touched metal and paused. Then carefully he moved some other things which were in the way and eased this metal object out. It was a small white cabinet with a mirror in its door and a keyhole. An old-fashioned bathroom medicine cupboard, in fact. We all know what that object is, right? He stood it on the Japanese table. The door swung open. Apart from a single shelf, it was quite empty. As empty as it had been when he'd first received it. a rather odd birthday present from Gillian just over a year ago. Omri sat back on his heels, staring at it. How clearly it all came back. The cupboard, the strange little key which had been his great-grandmother's and which had mysteriously fitted the commonplace lock and turned this ordinary little metal box into a time machine with a difference. Put any plastic object, an axe, an Indian teepee, a quiver of arrows into it, close the door, turn the key, and those things became real. Miniature, but real. Real leather, real cloth, real steel. Put the plastic figures of human beings or animals inside, and in the time it took to lock them, they too became real. Real and alive. And not just living toys, but people from another time, from their own lives with their own personalities and needs and demands. Oh, it hadn't been all fun and games, as Omri had naively expected at first. Little Bear was no toy to submit tamely to being played with. He was, for all his tiny stature, a ferocious savage, warlike and domineering. Omri had soon realized that if any grown-ups found out about the cabinet's magic properties, they would take it, and the Indian, and everything else, away. So Omri had to keep it secret, and look after, feed and protect his Indian as best he could. And when Patrick had found out the secret and sneaked a Texas cowboy into the cupboard so that he too could have a little person, the trouble really started. Little Bear and Boone, the cowboy, were natural enemies. They came close to killing each other several times. Even their respective ponies had caused endless difficulties. And then Adil had taken the cupboard one day, and the key had fallen out of the lock and had been lost, and Omri, Patrick, and the two little men had been faced with the dire possibility that the magic was dead, that these minute and helpless people would have to remain in Omri's time, his giant world, in his care, forever. It was this, the terrible fright that they had all had from this notion, that they had finally proved to Omri that he would have to give up his Indian friend. For friends, they were by then of a sort, and send the little people back to their own time, through the magic of the cupboard. When the key was found, that's what they all agreed upon. But it was so hard to part that Boone, who was shamingly soft-hearted for a cowboy, had cried openly, and even the boy's eyes were wet. Omri seldom let himself think of those last moments. They upset him so much. When they'd reopened the cupboard door, there were two groups. Little Bear and his wife, Omri had found him, Bright Stars, sitting on Little Bear's pony, and Boo-Hoo Boone on his white horse. Only now they were plastic again. Patrick had taken Boone and put him in his pocket, and Omri had kept the Indians. He had them still. He had packed them in a little wooden box, which he kept safely at the very bottom of the chest. Actually, it was a box within a box within a box. Each was tied tightly with string. There was a reason for all this. Omri had wanted to make them difficult to get at. He had always known that he would be tempted to put Little Bear and Bright Stars into the cupboard again and bring them back to life. His curiosity about how they were getting on, that alone tormented him every day. They had lived in dangerous times of war between tribes, wars aided and encouraged by Frenchmen and Englishmen who were fighting on American soil in those far-off days. What he's talking about is the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia. But that was the time that Little Bear was from, is in the late 1700s, but just a few years before the American Revolution. Very interesting time, very interesting conflict, especially if you're an American. You can look it up, 7 Years' War. That's what he's describing for Little Bear. Boone's time, the cowboy, the time of the pioneering of Texas, 100 years after Little Bear's era, so we're talking about the late 1800s, was dangerous too. That's truly the Wild West we might know of stereotypically today. There had been another little man, Tommy, the British medical orderly from the First World War. They'd magicked him to life to help when Little Bear was kicked by his horse, when Boone was dying of an arrow wound. Tommy might, just might, still be alive in Omri's world, but he would be terribly old, about 90 by now. Again, remember, this was the early 1990s this book was written. By putting their plastic figures into the magic cupboard, by turning the magic key, Omri had the power to recall them to life, to youth. He could snatch them from the past. The whole business nearly blew Omri's mind every time he thought at all deeply about it. So he tried not to think about it too much. And to prevent his yielding to temptation, he had given his mother the key. She wore it around her neck on a chain. It was quite decorative. People often asked her about it, and she would say, "It's Omri's, really. He lends it to me." This wasn't the whole truth. Omri had pressed it on her and begged her to keep it safe for him. Safe not just from getting lost again, but safe from him, from his longing to use it again, to reactivate the magic, to bring back his friends, to bring back the time when he had been not happiest, but most intensely, dangerously alive himself. That's chapter 3. Thanks for reading with me, and we'll pick it back up on chapter 4, the sweet taste of triumph. Thanks for listening.